Hey, welcome to Knowit Agile Agent podcast. So I am Kari Kakkonen at Knowit. I'm training Agile and DevOps and testing and doing other things around those topics as well. And today I have a guest, a really famous software testing person and many other things, Paul Gerrard, a friend of mine from a long time and based in UK. But maybe Paul, you want to introduce yourself a little bit.
Okay, thanks, Kari, for the invitation. I started life, I did an engineering degree and was going to be a civil engineer. But the first day of my first job, the partner said, "We've got no work for you, but we've had a computer delivered a few days ago. Here are the manuals, go and have a play, see what we can do with it." And that was my brief. So I did very little engineering. I just played on computers all the time. And that was it. I was into software. So I got over the course of 3 jobs, I became a software engineer, did some up to project management over a course of about 10 years or so, and then got into testing. And that was about 30 years ago. And I've been in the testing game ever since. And I've done a bit of everything across testing, you know that. So yeah, that's me.
Lots of good books, lots of good exercises, good courses. I've been to many of those and read many books as well. So yeah.
So I've written one big book with a friend, Neil Thompson, and 4 or 5 little pocket books. And I think pocket books are better. I don't think people like big books.
And lean Python is great. Yeah.
Oh right. Okay. Oh, of course. Yeah, because I came over and did a class with you guys, didn't I?
Course. Yeah, back then.
Yeah.
So Agile is the context anyway, and testing is always part of Agile. So how would you say how important testing is for any software? What would you say?
Testing tells you where you are. So a developer might say, I'm done, and the next question is, well, yeah, okay, you think you're done, but does it work? And they say, yeah, of course it works. And then you can ask them, well, how do you know? And then they go very quiet and they say, well, I've done this and this and this. And then a tester would say, well, that's about 5% of what I'm going to do when I test it. So it's the tester that gives you knowledge, information about achievement, what I would call achievement. Mm-hmm. So when a story is done, it's done because the tester says it's done, in that I've got evidence to show that it's reached a certain standard, whatever that is, because the tester's there to discover information about what works, what doesn't work, and what doesn't work gets fixed, and what does work, we applaud that, and we use that to make a decision on what we do next. So testing is completely essential. You cannot separate testing from development in that way. We tried that with waterfall and it doesn't work as well. It's as simple as that. So, but you still have testing.
Yeah. You need to do testing a lot earlier, as early as you can, basically. Maybe you want to elaborate that a little bit. How early can you do testing?
Well, as early as you like. As soon as someone has a conversation about an idea, a tester can say, or think, how would I test that? Mm-hmm. And then as soon as they start thinking about how I would test that, you can start making comments about, well, what if this happens and what if that happens, and what's the data that is required to make this idea, this transaction, this feature work? And then you get like a vague answer, but even with the vague answer, the tester can say, well, that's interesting, because I can think of already hundreds of things I can ask you about how this thing behaves. Yeah. And so, if you like, it's the tester can be the critical thinker right up front, right at the very beginning. And most people are not critically thinking when they're having ideas and sketching ideas on whiteboards and imagining what they're going to do. The tester has to bring it down to earth and to say, well, hold on, have you thought about this? Have you thought about that? What's the risk of this? What's the possibility of that? So testing, I think, can start, doesn't always start, but can start right at the very beginning, even with ideas. And at any point later, testers can join in, but the later, the worse. The earlier, the better, I think.
Yeah, I agree, and I like critical thinking talk as well. It's lots of things I talk about critical thinking also often, and that's
exactly. Yeah.
And you mentioned risk. I remember maybe even the first time I found you in the world was your risk-based testing.
E-business testing.
Yeah, you had lots of these risks.
Well,
maybe you want to talk about risks a little bit more.
Yeah, that's more than 20. Yeah. More than 20 years ago.
Yeah.
So that's how long we've known each other. Yeah, so I had this idea that, I mean, everybody was talking about risk and risk-based testing, and I looked around and like no one had written anything on it. So people just talked about a risk is something we don't want to happen, so we should do some testing in that area. And that was it. Now, there's a more sophisticated approach to risk-based testing in software engineering, in the high integrity kind of arena. But again, it seemed very bureaucratic almost, So with the web-based stuff in the early 2000s, it seemed to me that there was a more accessible way of doing it. Even so, it was a big book. It was 330 pages. And I don't regret writing it, but I don't think I'd do it the same way. I think I'd write it in a little pocketbook now. Because a lot of the book isn't about risk-based testing. It's about the risks of web-based software development. And that's a separate story, if you like. So the mechanics of risk-based testing, I think, are quite simple. That was the contribution, I think, that myself and Neil Thompson made when we wrote it. But most people found the categories of risks and the tables of different types of risk in web-based development. They found that most useful, I think.
Yeah. I think risk drives everything. It's in the core of what kind of choices you make. Definitely. Yeah. But hey, you talk about assurance nowadays as well, and not only quality assurance, but assurance in general. So would you like to explain a little bit that?
I avoid using the Q word, quality, whenever I can. Okay, and that's another conversation. but assurance to me is you have this layer of activities, which is information finding, which is what testing does. Mm-hmm. What assurance is about giving direction to the people who are going to test stuff. Mm-hmm. So you might say, here's a risk that's way down the road, but you can think about it today. So it's kind of introducing risk at a management level, if you like. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Something the managers are aware of that is a problem, and introducing that. But it's also it's a whole discipline of saying in a big project, it fits much better in a big project than a small project. Mm-hmm. Again, that's another conversation. But in a big project, you can say, the assurance manager, let's say, who's not part of the team, who's not responsible for testing, is going to take part in entry and exit meetings for test phases and all phases in a project, I would suggest. They're going to review the test plans and approaches and strategies. They're going to review the statistics that are coming out of the test management process. And if you like, translating this mountain of information to a board level and saying, so, for example, when I worked at BP for a year, I was on the management board. So I reported to the chair of the management board, who was a very senior guy in BP. And essentially what would happen is every 6 weeks, there was a project meeting where the project would report to the management board and saying, this has gone well, this has gone not so well, revising timescales, da-da-da. And my job essentially was to say, they're not lying. Mm-hmm. Literally, it could be put as simple as that, in that I've checked all this. You can trust what they're saying because I've done it for you. I've checked it for you. And so it can be a very senior role, and testing is at the heart of it. So that's my vision of assurance. Within an agile team, I think the same questions can be asked. The tester can sit there with the developer and saying, how are you going to test this feature? And the developer might say, well, I need a bit of advice on this. What would you do? And you can say, well, I'm not a technologist, but I would look at this, and this, and I'd do some combinations. I mean, pair testing, pairwise testing, or whatever, automate this, don't automate that, don't worry about that bit, and give advice. And then say, look, well, I'm going to test it for myself and give you some feedback as well. So it's kind of assurance in the small. And it's still there. That discipline is still there, but that's a bigger role than just hands-on testing. You're taking a perspective of the more senior people about what's going on in these projects. So that's how I see assurance in the small and in the large. So,
well, that's pretty good. That's pretty good. In a way, when you put it like that, we have maybe used the same argumentation at Knowit and gone for the quality word. So we've been sort of doing opposing thing. but for same reasons, because testing only is it can be just reactive. It can be a bit too late. So if you really want to have a big picture of your quality, then let's talk about quality and all kind of things that lead into good quality. And testing is one part of those things, obviously, but it's not the only thing. And the managers may not want to talk about testers and testing, but they might be happy talking about the quality of a product and how good quality it is. So that's interesting. We've chosen, even our department name is automation and quality these days.
but I try and avoid using the word quality because it means something different to everybody else. And quality isn't a thing. It's a relationship between a stakeholder and the product. And different stakeholders have different perceptions of quality. So how can you test for that? It's now, don't get me wrong. To me, you can use the word quality as a shorthand for very nice things happening. Let's call it. I mean, that's trivializing it. But what I'm getting at is, I think we need to think much more carefully. If you want to talk about readiness of a system to go into production, for example, you don't need to use the word quality. You can say, well, here are the risks of concern. Here are the things that must work. We've got evidence that the most important stuff, the goals are being met or addressed, and that the risks of most concern, we've got evidence that say that we fixed the problems. We've now got evidence. It seems very reliable. It seems to meet our criteria. And I don't need to use the word quality. Because quality doesn't add anything. It doesn't have an intrinsic meaning that has value to me. So I was taught this 30 years ago by my first boss, who didn't like the word quality either, and he convinced me. And I said, "Yeah, you've got a point there."
That's nice.
It's not a popular view, but I think it's a legitimate view.
Yeah, I get that. It's good. Yeah. You also mentioned you talked about some years ago about this new model of testing quite a bit. So how do you see this position of testing these days?
Well, I run a session. I used to run a thing called the Test Management Forum, and I run a session. This is about 10, 12 years ago now. I have this idea of saying, well, how do testers think? We know what they do. We read requirements, we design test cases, we script them, whatever, or we explore software with maybe not so good requirements, and we learn what the product does, and then we speculate on what it should do and what it should not do, and we test accordingly. And I thought, well, okay, is there not a single thought process that both test testing approaches would adopt? And I thought, well, that would be an interesting thing to think about. So I did, and ran a couple of sessions with some friends, and we kind of whiteboarded some ideas, and I had this old spidery mess. Anyway, I tried to pull it together, and what I call the new model for testing is it's a map or a model of the different modes of thinking that testers go through when they either do exploratory testing or scripted testing or building automation or any kind of testing of software systems you want to name, because we need to separate what I call logistics, which is process, tools, organization. That's not relevant to the way testers think. And the thought process, I think I'm suggesting, is universal. And when you understand the thought process, then you can say, well, we do incident management this way. We document at this level, at a high level or not at all. We interpret results, and those results might be a verbal report by a tester or some sketchy on a whiteboard, or it could be 1,000-page output from a test tool. And these things, the logistics differ, but the thought process is the same. And that's kind of the argument that I use for it. So I find it useful to me to explain the debate about automation. Like, we can replace testers with tools. No, you can't. Test execution automation covers one of the 10 thought processes. There are 9 other thought processes involved in testing, and test execution tools address one. And well or badly, I don't care, but that's the kind of the game we're in. And so I use it to talk more, I think, more intelligently about what's behind the logistics. Why have we got a process to do this when we could just talk to each other? That's the agile mentality.
Exactly. So we all need to be able to talk to each other and talk about testing and understand testing and getting things done well, in good quality using my word.
Yeah. It's okay. You can use the word quality. It's okay. I'm not going to.
That's good. But maybe one last question. What do you see in future for testing?
Well, I think the future is healthy. We still need it. It's not going to go away. And we talked about AI earlier on, didn't we? And AI, I think, will support some of the thinking, but it won't do all the thinking for us. So there's thinking about permutations and combinations. Well, that's for a tool to do. But the model, I think, this is the human aspect, is like the model that comes out of our exploration of either requirements or exploration of a system. That model is the human contribution, and the significance of the model and the usefulness of the model is a human view. The tool, if we can capture those models, tools can then trace paths and generate scenarios, test scripts, automation, data. Yeah, fantastic. That's logistics. And this is why I think it was useful. This is 10 years ago now. I think if we understand how we think, that's the core of what testers contribute, how we think. And almost everything outside that area of thought processing can be supported by technology. And I think that's the way we should move forward and regard technology as supporting our thinking, not doing stuff. You know, we shouldn't think of it as running tests. We should think of a test execution tool as implementing the imagined tests that people can create. That's probably not very well explained, but I think tools can help us build models and process models. The humans can start or initiate that process, and we're the judge of whether the model is appropriate or not, and whether it's useful, because that model has to be appropriate to some stakeholders and maybe not others. So a model of code is useful to developers, but not useful to users. A model of the business process is useful to end users and businesses, but maybe not operations guys. You know, so models are appropriate. And so that's a human judgment. And so you can't take that away. So I still think models are the center of testing. Exploration is done by people, supported by tools potentially. We are the judges of whether models are appropriate or useful. So I think we're not going to lose our way. We're not going to lose our job, I don't think.
we testers will still be there in future.
I think so. But I think we have to be smarter. You know? I think supported by technology, we probably don't need as many testers in the world. And that's just the way of all knowledge work. You know, knowledge work becomes more concentrated in individuals who are very skilled with technologies as well as the intellect. You know, we need both. I can't tell you much about it today, but I'm looking much more deeply on how we become a profession, as an engineering profession. I'm happy to use the term engineer, even though I think software doesn't obey the laws of physics. I think we are trying to become or have a more engineering focused approach to what we do. So this year I'm going to work hard on that. That's my kind of goal for this year.
Hearing about the results of that work.
Yeah. Well, I hope so. Not too far away. Not too far away, I think.
Be reading that then. Nice. Hey, Paul, thanks so much of being here in the Agile Agent podcast.
My pleasure.
And dear viewers, if you have any other topics that you would like to hear, or any feedback of this session, just drop us an email at agileagent@knowit.fi, or you can just add your comments under here, and like, of course, this podcast episode and the whole series. So thanks again for Paul for being here, and seuraavaan kertaan. Moikka moi!